Why does the universe exist at all? Why is there any universe? Why does it have all of this intricate order? Why are there laws? Why are there laws of physics?
Welcome to the Purposeful Lab, a podcast brought to you by the Magis Center. I'm Catherine Hadro, here with the better half of the podcast, Dr. Dan Kuebler, my co-host.
Yeah, I don't know about that, but
It's true. So here we are, episode 4, and we are finally going to be speaking about consciousness. Why is it important that we're addressing this topic now?
Yeah, so far in season 1, we've looked at sort of the order, the physics, at the foundation of the universe, and how that leads to sort of the chemistry, and how that leads toward life, and the evolution of life, and that order there that sort of directs that. And now we're looking at sort of how you get to the human person and the abilities that, say, you and I have to rationally have a conversation with each other and with the listeners. And we're looking at sort of conscious experience and rationality, and where do those come from? How do you get those out of this universe?
Yeah. Something I think will be helpful for our viewers and listeners. Again, you both discussed the topic of consciousness in depth. Just to define that term, consciousness, what do you mean when you discuss that in this episode? Yeah,
when we talk about that, the conscious experience is just that subjective experience that we have of our awareness of our surroundings. I'm aware of my surroundings, you're aware of your surroundings, and we both have our own sort of subjective experience of that. That's what we're talking about, of our conscious experience. And, the big, $1,000,000 question is, how does that conscious experience come to be? In a sense, it almost seems out of place in this physical world, right? It's sort of, there's this physical world that we've been talking about, and this order in it, but now we have this sort of new thing, this conscious experience that emerges, and it's one of those things that's most real to us, because that's it's how we interact with the world, right?
And you spoke with Dr. Stephen Barr, who's the professor emeritus of the Department of Physics and Astronomy at the University of Delaware. He's also the founder and president of the Society of Catholic Scientists, of which you are the vice president.
That's right.
You've known Professor Barr personally for years.
Yeah. I've known him for at least a decade now, and he's just a wonderful guy. I love talking to him, and he's just full of ideas. He's a physicist by trade, but he has thought deeply about a lot of these bigger issues, the bigger questions that are related to science and philosophy. So he's thought about not only cosmology and the origin of the universe and how that leads towards certain life forms, but also about how physics and consciousness are related. And he'll talk about that in the interview. Yeah. And he has, just been a great mentor to me as I've tried to learn about science, and particularly theology and philosophy. He's sort of in the Catholic world is sort of the leading intellectual in terms of that space, the science and faith. And so it's a delight to be able to talk to him.
No, that I'm excited. We're about to go to it in just a moment. And he's going to discuss, 3 different aspects: consciousness, rationality, and free will.
That's right. Yeah. So all topics that, I think interest a lot of people.
Yes, absolutely. So with that, let's go now to Dan's interview with Stephen Barr.
Well, Steve, welcome to the podcast. Great to have you on.
Well, thanks for having me.
Yeah, so you're a guest here on the first season of our podcast, and what we're looking at in this first season is sort of looking at the different sort of levels of order you see in the cosmos at different levels, at the level of physics, the chemistry, and the biology. And so we've looked at how the physics leads into the chemistry, and the chemistry dictates some of the biological solutions. We had Simon Conway Morris on as our last guest. And what we want to look at now is sort of look at how this order goes into sort of the human mind and human consciousness, right? So you're a physicist, so this is not your area of expertise per se, the mind, but there's a lot of sort of people that argue that, the physics and the chemistry sort of dictate sort of the and can explain human consciousness and human behavior. And so what is it, do you see, is there any thing that makes man stand out as, you can't just reduce him to the chemistry and the physics?
You mean make us stand out over other animals and creatures?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, well, I think, the differences between human beings and other animals are obvious and vast, but I think they're traceable to two powers that humans have, reason and free will. And everything else that we see, the dramatic differences between humans and animals, really, I think, are rooted in those powers.
And people say, just to be clear on what you mean by reason, because people say, look, that animal's acting reasonable. That's, that dog is going to the food and eating. That's a reasonable thing to people. That's not what you mean by reason.
Right. I mean, so for example, animals couldn't have the kind of conversation we're having here.
Right.
They don't have conceptual thought, abstract conceptual thought. They don't express themselves in propositions, in sentences.
Right.
So that's what I mean by reason.
Okay. And if you look at, what allows us to do this is largely our ability for human language, right? So it allows us to think, is that the key thing that makes us stand out, or is that just one aspect of rationality?
I think it's one aspect. Yeah. It's an essential part of rationality. Certainly the ability to express ourselves in propositions and in elaborate sentences. But there's more to it than that. They're the concepts and the understandings that we are expressing, which, you have to have something to say. It's not just the capacity.
Words,
it's not just the capacity to, computers can generate sentences.
Right.
But they don't have any thoughts. They're not expressing their own understanding. So there's more to it than just, say, the ability to construct sentences with proper grammar and syntax and so on. But that is an essential part of it.
So how does this come into existence? Is language something, that evolves gradually like other physical traits that you find in the human lineage? Or is it something that it's all or nothing? Because you have songbirds, you have other things that have some type of what people call language. Is that using language in the proper term, or is that a different type of thing?
Well, there is a widespread view. It's probably the dominant view of people who study these questions. And I'm a physicist, so I don't study that what we have linguistically is just more of what animals have. That it was a continuum, and that animals, had chimps have a certain amount. We just have more. I don't think that's persuasive, and there's a very important book by Berwick and Chomsky called "Why Only Us," and they make a very important distinction between what they call communication systems, which animals have, even bees, and have ways of communicating. There are mating calls, there are warning calls, and they communicate information. Bees can communicate with other bees, and the way they fly. But communication is one thing, but language in the way we have it is something quite different. And as I said, it involves first having abstract conceptual thought, but it also involves a kind of grammar that even songbirds or even no other animals have, where you have the ability to construct sentences of arbitrary length and complexity. And so our closest relatives, chimps, they don't have sentences. No. They most combine a couple of words, 2 words, I think. But they're not subject and verb and object. There's no grammar there. They have nothing that you could call propositional language.
Yeah. And that's the interesting thing about chimps, is that you can train them for years to try to grasp language or do things, and they just don't get the same sort of recursive language skills that humans sort of naturally just, a 1-2-year-old just picks up on just by listening to, whereas a chimp, you got to train the heck out of them, and they just don't seem to get it. And,
it's not surprising. if one is a scientist and one believes in evolution, as we do, if chimps had the neural machinery and the capacity for the kind of language we have, or gorillas,
right,
then it would confer a lot of advantages on them in survival, and they'd be doing it in the wild naturally all the time. But they don't. You have to try to force them, like a bear riding a bicycle. So we try to force them to imitate human. And they don't get very far. And so this is not really a capacity they have.
But evolutionary theory would argue that rationality or language would emerge in an evolutionary context at some point.
Yeah.
And the idea would be it would emerge gradually. You see like beginnings of it, maybe not in chimps, like our type of rationality, but would you expect, or is this something that it goes beyond the material, that you're not going to be able to see half a rational?
Right. I think what we have clearly, a lot of our mental architecture is inherited from our animal forebears, and our emotions are, a lot of our capacities are maybe almost all of them. But I think what we're talking about here is not that we have our minds are utterly different from animals, but that we have something extra added, that somehow at some point something happened that raised us to a higher level.
Right.
We have a dimension that they're lacking. We have what they have, and then
something.
And I think there are very strong philosophical arguments. And again, I'm a physicist, but I think there are strong philosophical arguments that go back to Aristotle, at least, that there are aspects of human rationality that go beyond what can be explained in material terms, as the behavior of some merely physical or material system. Right. And so, of course, from a Christian point of view, from a Catholic point of view, it would be the spiritual soul. So I think we don't want to say that our mind, or clearly our minds are the result of hundreds of millions of years of development, but something happened. There was a critical juncture, I think. Yeah. And Berwick and Chomsky were not religious, as far as I know. They feel that in the course of evolution, something happened just at the level of the neural machinery to process human language. Leave out free will and rationality, but just to process human languages, which have very sophisticated grammar, some neural changes had to happen, which had to be substantial changes, and probably had to happen rather quickly, and they were low probability events. But I gather from my biologist friends that there are in evolutionary history certain dramatic changes that happened once. They were one-off things. They were low probability, and they happened only once. Going from prokaryotic to eukaryotic cells,
from a single cell to multicellular.
So there were certain key big leaps in evolution that probably the result of a fortuitous confluence of events. And that's why they happened once, because they were quite low probability.
Yeah.
But this is getting beyond my field.
Well, it's interesting, because I get questions about this all the time when I give talks about evolution. Say, when did you have organisms that are like you and me, that are rational, can have language? And there's a lot of debate in the field about Neanderthals, for example, right? Were Neanderthals rational in the sense you and I are? Did they have language? And they'll point to a few things. But look at these cave paintings. Sure. There's some very decorative cave paintings that look like, somebody with symbolic, rational thought must have made these. Or maybe this is burial practices. Now, there's debate over whether they were or not, but is that a ceremonial burial practice? And,
it's sort of lost in the mists of antiquity, as they say. I mean, the paintings they've recently discovered Neanderthals making, I think in Spain, are really quite dramatic and suggest some sort of symbolic thought. And a lot of times people say, well, rationality equals symbolic thought. It may be more complicated, because there may be kinds of symbolic thought that you involved in artistic expression, and maybe different types involved in propositional language. So what Neanderthals had, we may never know. There seems to be evidence where I think there's a lot of doubt whether they had language in our sense, but they certainly had. It seems some of them had quite remarkable ability to make symbolic cave
images. Yeah, definitely. And they did have ability to interbreed with modern humans. Sure. So there's some overlap with our species already. Sure. So that might bleed into that somehow. You hit it on this a little bit about trying to find say a natural sort of underpinning for the human brain, and clearly for human consciousness, and clearly it's dependent upon our brain and the proper wiring of the proper structure. But there are those, particularly in the scientific community, it seems like they just want to reduce, say, human consciousness, human experience, everything to merely the physical. Like
right.
they can explain it all based on the underlying physics.
Right. This is the big trend. It's not recent. It's been going on for a long time. That everything is reducible to physical science, ultimately to physics.
Right.
You know, biology is reducible to chemistry, chemistry to physics. And as a physicist, I should like that, but it doesn't. It really doesn't work. And so there are several things that I think cannot be reduced to physics. Let's just talk about mental phenomena. One is consciousness, which even animals presumably have.
Yeah.
Rationality and free will. But even if you take consciousness, which say a dog or a cat or a frog presumably has, there are very strong arguments, I think absolutely, I would say compelling arguments, that you cannot reduce consciousness to physics. Now, it's not to say that consciousness is a miraculous or supernatural. I think consciousness is a natural phenomenon. When you have certain physical structures there, I think consciousness naturally arises as a consequence of it. And certain kinds of physical structures give certain types of conscious experiences, and others give other types. But it's not, so the physical structures and processes might cause conscious phenomena. But the causality is not the kind that physics can explain. Even if you had a complete physical description of some entity, in classical physics, it would be knowing what all the positions and velocities and so on, all the particles and the strengths of the fields. But even in a quantum mechanical level, if you knew the wave function of the system exactly, you had an exhaustive, complete physical description of what all those material things are doing. There's no way to derive from that, logically or mathematically, any conclusion about whether that entity was having conscious experiences, there was any subjectivity, any mind, any consciousness there. And that shows it's not physics, because in physics, when you explain one physical phenomenon as being the result of another, you are able to derive the effect from the cause using the equations that come from the laws, fundamental laws of physics. It's a mathematical and logical deduction or derivation. I can show you why if you put the glass of water in the microwave and turn it on. I can explain to you from the equations why the water boils. You can't explain consciousness coming from physical phenomena in that way. Consciousness is something natural, I would think. It is, I say, certainly not something that's a part of physics. So the dream of reducing everything to physics, which is what a lot of materialists have, it fails even at that level, let alone things like rationality and free will, which are even higher than consciousness.
Right.
It doesn't explain things in that way. It can't explain that kind of phenomenon. But there's actually arguments coming from physics that actually seem to imply that not everything is physical, and in particular something about the mind. There's a famous argument, it goes back to the foundations of quantum mechanics, that physics cannot account for everything about what are called in quantum mechanics observers. And it's very easy to state the point. In quantum mechanics, you have systems that are described by the equations. They're called the system, and that you make predictions about, measurements on. And then there's somebody doing the measurements, because quantum mechanics is all about the results of measurements. And so there's someone who does the measurements, that's called the observer. And you can show that if you try to describe not only the system that you're measuring, but the measurer or the observer using the equations, if you try to completely describe the observer exhaustively, you run into paradoxes and contradictions. So there's a strong argument, it goes back to the 1930s, and some famous physicists, including Nobel Prize winner, have made the argument that there's something about the observer that escapes the descriptions of the physical description. And so even physics itself seems to point to its own limitations here, that it's saying that there are things that go beyond it. So it's kind of interesting. The physics is pointing to its own boundary, as it were. Furthermore, well, we can talk about free will if you'd like, but quantum mechanics has some interesting implications there.
Yeah.
Should I get into that? Okay.
Sure.
Yeah. Well, see, one of the big arguments that everything is that we don't have free will, and free will, as I said, is one of the powers of human beings. It separates us. Traditionally, has been thought to separate us from lower animals. Reason and free will there was always this thought among physicists, or for a long time, that physics is deterministic. That is, that if you tell me the state, or if you specify the state of a physical system at one time, the laws of physics rigidly determine how the system will unfold in the future. The universe runs on rails, so to speak. The equations of physics are so rigid that the past uniquely determines the future. So everything that I do, whether I pick up this glass of soda, that's all comes from the laws of physics. Determined that from the state of the physical world.
If we knew the
billion
physical
years
state,
ago,
we could know that.
And so I can't have free will. But what quantum mechanics showed is that this kind of what's called physical determinism is simply false. That the laws of physics are not rigid in that way. The laws of physics do not uniquely tell you how the world is going to unfold. It tells you not what is definitely going to happen. It tells you the relative probabilities of various things happening. That was a huge change when you went from what was called classical physics to quantum. In classical physics, the equations did determine the future. In quantum physics, they do not. They only determine probabilities. So that really kicked the legs out from under what had been a very powerful argument that had been around for hundreds of years against free will. From the time of Isaac Newton, a lot of people were worried. Scientists were worried. How can we have free will given what Newton has shown us about the world? But quantum mechanics kind of cut the legs out from under that anti-free will argument. It doesn't explain free. Quantum mechanics doesn't say there is free will. It doesn't say there is. It doesn't explain it. But it removes one of the big arguments against it that seemed to be coming from physics.
So it creates the space for it to actually make sense.
If the world is open to multiple possibilities, at least it makes it not out of the question that we can select among those possibilities.
So then would you argue that free will, so quantum mechanics at least opens up the space for it, but it's not something, free will, that you can reduce to the physics, right?
No,
and
and again, that's I would say they're along with reason and consciousness, which is a lower thing. I don't think physics is capable of or any purely material explanation can account for free will.
Yeah.
And this is why some of us believe that we have a spirit. When people often don't know what spiritual mean, maybe they think it has to do with seances and something spooky and ectoplasm. Traditionally, what the word spiritual meant in Christian tradition, going back for 2,000 years, the powers of the human being that were spiritual, that made us most in the image of God, were reason and free will. And so that's what we mean. And so, and those, as I say, I think they're very strong arguments, some of them coming from physics, some of them philosophical, that those do not simply flow out of the equations of physics.
Yeah. So that if you look at, like, science is sort of coming up against its limits in the sense of what it can and what it can't do. And part of that is to, at least from what we've talked about, is to describe the fullness of, like, the human person, right? But it can't even seem to, based on what you're saying, describe the fullness of a dog in a sense, because a dog has an aspect to him or her that is not reducible to physics, because dogs, I assume my dog is conscious. I don't know.
We have to assume. See, that's the thing. We don't know.
Yeah.
All we can observe about a dog is its physical behavior, how it's moving, the sound waves coming out of its mouth, and so on. And from that, we can't. That illustrates what I said. From what you can measure about a dog or observe, you can't infer anything rigorously about whether it has a conscious experience. We kind of figure it does. I think my dog, when it wants a piece of bacon, it's because it tastes good. Not just because certain neurons are firing and the machinery is doing this, but it's experiencing something. It's having sensations and mental experiences. But But yes, even a dog, and this is quite mysterious. This has nothing to do with religion, by the way.
Right.
A dog, Christianity says nothing about the mental experiences of a dog and whether they are or are not reducible to physics. But they don't seem to be reducible to physics, and I think that's significant.
Yeah, no. Thomas Nagel has that famous paper about what's it like to be a bat, that we can't actually understand the conscious experience of a bat because we're stuck in human conscious experience. Now I can, maybe get an idea of what you're thinking
because we can talk.
We can because
we can converse and express ideas that now, of course, with ChatGPT, of course, if you I think you can tell if you talk to ChatGPT enough, you realize
if you ask it enough questions,
it doesn't actually have ideas, but that's different. But there's no way to know. Now, there's another philosopher, Thomas Nagel is one, who would argue that mind is not reducible to physics, and he's an atheist. But another great philosopher of our time, Saul Kripke, made the point, and I think it's a decisive point. He said, you could imagine a universe that had exactly the same laws of physics that ours had, but was devoid of consciousness.
Right.
There were no there's no such thing as consciousness. And had all the same laws of physics, the general relativity and quantum mechanics, all the laws that our universe has. And there's nothing illogical about supposing there's in the idea of such a universe. There's no inconsistency in saying there's such a universe. And so that sort of illustrates that these mental phenomena don't come out, they're not derivable from, they're not necessary logical consequences of having physics. There's something beyond physics.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's one of the things people have written about, like what separates us from other apes in terms of behaviors, and that's that theory of mind, that they don't seem to recognize that there's a mind behind this other chimp, and that other mind has different thoughts or different beliefs or different understanding that you do, where because they can't articulate
there's so many things in which we differ from our closest extant relatives, the chimps. It's hard to know which ones are required, which ones could have been the result of a gradual development, and which ones required really something radically, qualitatively new. I mean, I could imagine a non-rational animal having a theory, having some notion of itself and some notion that this other member of its species had a mind and had intentions and so on. I'm not sure I put what they call theory of mind as the decisive thing. Again, I'd say it's rationality, which is closely tied to our ability. It's not the same thing, but I think at least with humans, and our reason is closely tied to our ability to think in propositions, to state propositions, to grasp abstract ideas.
Right. Yeah. So do you think, what does that suggest to you about the human person, if it's not fully reducible to the science, right? Mm-hmm. So does that tell you anything about, give you any clue of like, how do you explain who we are and what we're here for?
What we're here for, no. And I think even atheists like Richard Dawkins would admit, they say science cannot tell you anything about morality or what goals we should pursue. And so I'm a physicist, and I will state flatly that physics will never tell us, what the meaning of life is, or how we should live our lives, or what makes somebody a good person or a bad person. Physics is quite limited. As I said, it's about equations. It's about equations that describe the behavior of matter, how matter changes through time. That's all physics is, and therefore it's quite limited. And the people who dream of reducing everything to physics are, well, I can understand it at one level. Physics has been so successful after 400 years. It's staggering. There's nothing, you look around you at the physical world. I'm talking about minds, but anything in the physical world, we either understand how it works or have in hand the tools to understand how it works. The things that are not understood about the physical world are things at the subnuclear level, are things having to do with the universe on large scales. And so, but look around you in your everyday world. We understand a tremendous amount, a vast amount. And I think it's that fantastic explanatory success of physics that then got people to think, well, it'll explain everything.
It gets intoxicating.
It'll explain everything. But if they sit back and ponder a little bit, and at the very nature of physics, they'll see that there are certain kinds of things that it just can't explain by the nature of how it operates.
Yeah, that's a good place to end. There is a cottage industry out there of physics tells you the universe is this way and the meaning of life, but I think you make a great point of like the limits of physics' equations.
You can't do a calculation and say, therefore, thou shalt not steal. Or,
right.
Therefore, love your neighbor.
Right.
It doesn't work that way.
Transcends that. Yeah. Great. Well, it was great having you on, Steve. We'll certainly have to have you come back and talk more about cosmology and
I look forward to it.
Yeah.
Well, Dan, that was a fascinating interview. I love the questions that you asked. And Steve Barr, like you said, yes, his career has been in physics, but he's obviously thought about all these different questions in regards to science.
Yes. And he's got a depth and a breadth of thinking that you can always learn something from listening to his opinions on these things. So,
yes. Something that stood out to me was how he was pretty clear that consciousness is a natural phenomenon, but it's not a part of physics.
Yeah, I think it's not reducible to the physics. Right? He said there's no equation that you can point to that leads to consciousness. It's a natural thing. We see it in ourselves. We see it in others. We see it in other animals. Right. So it's in the natural world. You have these conscious things, but it's called the hard problem of consciousness because it's hard to explain. So how is it that when neurons are firing in my brain, I have this rich sensory experience of seeing Catherine and the microphone and my pen here? There isn't necessarily an equation that you can point to that all falls out, right? So it's somewhat of a mystery, but it is a mystery that is at the very heart of who we are as people, because it's our consciousness that allows us to think about things, and having that conscious experience allows us to talk and to think and so forth. Right? It's a prerequisite, at least. Okay, it doesn't,
Exactly.
I'm not saying dogs are going to do that; they're conscious, but they don't. But we need to have that consciousness to get to that point.
Well, I will say, speaking of dogs, I was just thinking, and probably on behalf of other pet owners as well. Okay, like, are my cats rational? Like, do they actually love me? But I don't know if
I think
can answer that question.
Well, they're conscious. They're not rational. They might act, do things that seem reasonable, right? And this is the point that Dr. Barr made. They're not rational in the way that you and I are. That they have reason and the capacity for conceptual thought, and language, which is one of the aspects of conceptual thought, and that's. Although sometimes I think they might, the cats particularly, they seem to have vengeance and envy and all those things.
Be careful now how you talk about cats.
Okay, yeah,
there we go.
My cat gets its revenge on me. She meows at 4:00 every morning to go outside. So
she knows what she's doing.
She keeps me in my place.
To that point, there was another point that Dr. Barr made about determinism versus free will. And can you expand on that?
Yeah, you're right. Determinism, the idea that everything that I do, if you knew every measurement of like what this neuron is doing, where the air is at every time, where the sound waves are in the room, you could predict everything happening in the future. So if we knew everything that happened in the past, we could predict what's going to happen in the future, and we could extrapolate what happened in the even more distant past, right? But the point of quantum physics is that we are unable to determine that this determinism doesn't work. The Newtonian determinism doesn't work anymore, and we can't predict. So even if we had full knowledge of the state of everything in this room, we can't predict what's going to happen next with certainty, because there is an inherent uncertainty in it, and that opens up the space for free will. So a quantum universe is one that is amenable to free will. The two fit nicely together. It's not that quantum physics, as he said, isn't free will, but it destroys this idea of determinism that we can predict, and I'm just a robot. Light hits me and I respond, right? That type of thing.
And this really, I think, set us up perfectly for next week's episode 5 with Dr. Kuebler of Christendom, where we'll be talking about how we can learn about our purpose from the nature around us.
Yeah, right. And this is where we jump from sort of the looking at the natural world to bringing it home to who we are, right? And our biology, our physics, the chemistry that make us up actually move on to the higher levels, that you get this emergence of consciousness and now the emergence of purpose, and things like that.
I'm looking forward to that as well. Well, that brings us to this week's office hours segment, and I have some questions for you. So there's a new study from the General Social Survey, and it reveals 39% of U.S. adults say they had a, quote, great deal of confidence in the scientific community. But that number is down from 48% back in 2018 and in 2021. And the survey may not be a surprise. It revealed the two major political parties' trust levels headed in opposite directions. Democrats reported a growing level of confidence in science. Republicans showed a lower level. I'm just curious what you make of this trend.
Yeah, I think this is, the result of the politicization of science, which is not surprising. Science is a human enterprise, right? So science is done by people like you and I, and we have biases and so forth, and prejudices and hypotheses we want to be correct, and there's economic interest and so forth. So science can easily be politicized, just like any other discipline can be. And so I think, particularly with COVID, where over that the pandemic, there was a huge amount of politicization of science on both sides, and I think that led to some people being less enlightened. I think people don't realize how tentative science is, right? Our scientific conclusions are often very tentative because we don't have enough information, and they change from month to month as we get more information. And I think people wanted science to do more than it could, and other people wanted to do less than it could, and so you ended up with problems on both sides. And I think part of it is people don't have a full understanding of what science is, what are the limits of science, how tentative a lot of scientific conclusions are. So it doesn't surprise me that we've lost trust in science over the last few years, and the political divisions don't surprise me, given the politicization of science. And it's part of human nature, unfortunately.
No, that's well said. That's a really good point. Okay, so my next question is, and I want to be clear, we are not a health advice podcast in any way, shape, or form. But when I was thinking about a question I'm interested in asking you as a biologist, something that came to mind is really this big question when it comes to health and wellness and longevity of life that I've been wondering about. We always hear about the importance of sleep and getting a full night's rest, and the importance of exercising and making sure we're exercising enough, and of nutrition and eating well, and on top of that, of stress management. There's a lot to juggle, but I wanted to ask you, as a biologist, is there one habit, in your opinion, that you think has the biggest impact on someone's health and longevity of life? I think what I'm ultimately asking is, which of those pillars, if you will, most greatly impacts our cells and our biology? It's a great question. I teach an exercise physiology class, so I'm a little biased, but I think the data bears this out as well, is that the biggest thing you can do to help your health and longevity is exercise, more so than diet or sleep. Not that those aren't important, but the interesting thing about exercise is that it not only benefits you physically, but it is, more than anything else, benefits you mentally. So even more so than reading and doing mental puzzles, which you always hear, do those to help you mentally. But exercise releases all kinds of growth factors, goodies for your brain. It's like drugs for your brain to help your brain. So there's all these studies that show that exercise not only helps you physically, keep the body healthy, stressing, and it's only moderate exercise that you really need, maybe 3 hours of exercise a week at, brisk walking. Well, it all depends on how much exercise you've done, but you don't have to go out and run marathons to get the benefits of that, which, I think it's probably the thing that, it's the best predictor, I think, of how long someone is gonna live and how healthy they're gonna be, is their sort of exercise regimen. Not that people can exercise and still run into all kinds of problems, but you're the cross country coach, aren't you? So you have a long life ahead of you.
I hope so. Other than my knees, which I'm going to have to get fixed at some point.
I'm not going to lie. I was kind of hoping you'd say sleep is the most important, and I would just give all my energy to rest and sleep. But as always, Dr. Dan Kuebler, thank you so much. That wraps up episode 4 of the Purposeful Lab. But for our listeners and viewers, make sure to head on over to the Maggia Center website. You can see everything about the Purposeful Lab, and make sure to subscribe to this podcast. We'll see you next week.